Thanks for tuning in to the Drive On podcast, where we are focused on giving hope and strength to the entire military community. Whether you're a veteran, active duty, guard, reserve, or a family member, this podcast will share inspirational stories and resources that are useful to you. I'm your host, Scott DeLucio, and now let's get on with the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Drive On podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Jan Canty. Dr. Canty is a psychologist of about 40 years, and in 1985, her spouse was murdered, and she has since made it her life mission to help other homicide survivors. And I'm having her on the podcast today, not necessarily to talk directly about homicide, but we deal with all sorts of different kind of death, combat death, and training accidents and things like that in the military community. And so I'm having her come on to talk about some of the unique aspects of those types of death and really help us try to process those things in our own lives with the people that we know. So welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you're here. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Well, I was born, raised, educated, and widowed in Detroit. I was married to a man 11 years. I was in training to be a psychologist. He was a psychologist when he failed to come home one night from work. And long story short, within 10 days, they'd found his body. He had been he had been cornered and beaten to death with a baseball bat and killed. And then the man who killed him, John Fry, dismembered him and took him up to northern Michigan and buried him in a shallow grave. I think that what brought it all to light was their accomplice who helped with the burial. He did not participate in the killing, but he helped to cover up. Had he not come forward, I don't know that they would have ever figured it out. But he did, and they got caught, and they both got sentenced. There was two people involved, and I had no knowledge of what had happened. So I sat across from Inspector Gil Hill, who, by the way, incidentally, was just coming off the set of Eddie Murphy's Beverly Hills Cop 1. He was the Inspector Todd, and he's just like that guy in real life. Let me tell you, a man of very few words, kind of intense. And he basically said, your husband's dead and we need you to go to the morgue and identify his identifiable body parts. And I had a remarkable detective go with me who prepped me on the way as best she could and literally stood by my side through the identification process. She did not have to do that. That's not part of her duties, but she did it. And she was there at the prelim exam. I did not go to the trial. I elected not to because nothing in that trial would change my life. I'd still be a widow. I'd still have a house to sell. I'd still have the media haunting me. And I just wanted nothing to do with it. So ultimately, after 2 years of being really bothered by the press, I did not know then why, but later I realized one of the reporters was writing a book, and that's why he wouldn't let it go. But ultimately, I left Michigan altogether, which I did not want to do. It was my home. And I changed my name and I started teaching rather than doing clinical work. And I taught grad school for a number of years. And it helped me to get away, to get some perspective. I ended up, now this is back in 1985, as you said, this is before the internet. This is before grief counseling. This is before medication. This is before anything. I did not know a soul that had been through what I'd been through. I had no one to talk to. I did not know where to turn. So I thought, it's up to me to fix me. There's nobody. My family wasn't there. They didn't even live in the same state. As part of my training, we never had one single class session on violent death and how to help somebody with that. So I had to improvise. So what I ended up doing is I fell back on this old model, which I still believe today is very beneficial. It's called the Biocycle social model. And what it basically says, if you want to change your behavior, if you want to change your outlook, you have to look at all three domains, the biological, the psychological, and the sociological. And if you can do all three, you're going to be making some headway. So Biologically, I got myself in shape. I started doing triathlons. I went to the gym religiously every morning at 6:30 with a group of other women who ended up doing the triathlons with me. We ended up doing 5 together. I didn't break any records. I don't want to give you that impression. My goal was to simply survive. I wanted to not be the person who had a heart attack the minute they jumped in the water and the person who crossed the finish line. Somewhere in between there, I would have been fine. And I was, and I did 5 one year and a couple the next. So physically, I wanted to get in shape, and that was priority to me. I also psychologically decided, I needed to look at this differently. I needed to look at what was not changed in my life as a result of the PTSD, number one. And number two, what could I use from having those symptoms to benefit me? And I thought, I can become a better psychologist for it, because I've been on both sides of it. This is not coming out of a textbook. I know what it's like to awake in a cold sweat with nightmares. I know what it's like to have flashbacks. I know what it's like to be jumpy around people and extremely defensive and angry. And I'm not normally an angry person, but I'd go into the grocery store and I would be upset that loaves of bread did not come for one person. I mean, that's irrational. But I'm like, what's wrong with people that they can't have a loaf of bread for one person? Why is it, implying that you're part of a family or couple? Or I'd go to the Hallmark section and there would not be one sympathy card that was suitable for homicide. And that upset me. It was like we were invisible. And then to make matters worse, you turn on the news or the better yet, Hollywood stuff, and how it's depicted there as entertainment was just infuriating to me. And I thought, I've got to stop looking for reasons to be angry and start appreciating what isn't changed in my life, which spilled over into the third section, which is the sociological part of healing. And I just thought, I've got to see things differently. So in one of my grad classes I was teaching was cross-cultural psychotherapy, which I totally enjoyed. Nobody else wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole, but I really wanted the class. So they're like, yay, go take it. So I did. And I thought, if I'm going to teach about other cultures, then I had better go experience other cultures. So I traveled the world and I went to very, very remote places in various ways. Sometimes I went as a volunteer. Sometimes I went as a photographer because I was into photography. I'd go as a photography group, but I always tried to stay off the beaten path. And by the way, I was teaching graduate school at Fort Lewis, which is a military post. It's now called, it's the Joint Base McChord Fort Lewis, but then it was just Fort Lewis. And so I really got a perspective on what tragedy can be like. I mean, I had clean water. I had a roof over my head. I had rights as a woman. I had the legal system behind me. I had my health. I had my education. And that really put things in perspective that I would not have otherwise appreciated had I not traveled extensively. And as an intern, I went to 5 different continents. The only thing that interrupted me was cancer and COVID. The 2 of them were kind of a whammy. So the double whammy, but eventually I want to make all 7 of them. And that was a big event in my life too. So it really put I'm like, it isn't so bad. I could be much worse than it was. It could have been much worse. Right. And so between the 3 of them and not those 3 parts, the biopsychosocial as well as not talking about it for 30 years, I came out of it with a different view of me, of the world, because I realized it wasn't my anger and wasn't that the world had changed. I had changed. And it wasn't really any different than it had ever been. Another thing I did, which happened when Hurricane Katrina hit, is I volunteered with the Red Cross and I went down to Shreveport, Louisiana. I was stationed there. And it's the only time I can tell you that I have even a glimmer of idea what it's like to be in the military, because I've never personally been in the military. But I know I was there during the hurricane, and you don't sleep. You're there, and when they say to be there and where to go, and you don't ask questions, you show up, you do what you can, you hope you're making a difference, and you don't ask questions. You're just there to save lives in my situation. And you're eating it, breathing it, thinking about it nonstop. You lose your sense of dates and times because you're not waking and sleeping at normal hours, and you don't have any contact with the outside world. It wasn't like I had any clue what was going on in CNN or in Texas or anything. It was like everything about it was the hurricane. And after my time there was up, I was being sent home. I remember going to the airport and I felt like a fish out of water because I'm looking at these people that are well groomed. First of all, I look like a train wreck, and their concerns were so trivial. It's like, what do you mean I can't have my hot dog on the airplane? And I'm like, do you realize what happened just an hour from this airport? People are dying and you're worried about your damn hot dog. I mean, that's what I felt like saying, you know?
Right.
And we were instructed not to wear our Red Cross uniforms anywhere out of the area. And I'm like, am I supposed to be ashamed that I'm a Red Cross volunteer? But you're not supposed to talk about it, mention it on the plane, nothing. And I had just felt like I had been on another planet by the time I got home. I didn't feel like people could relate to what I'd seen, to what I'd smelled, to what I'd heard. I didn't know if what I had done had made any difference whatsoever in the big picture. And the only tangible thing I had left was a couple of kids' drawings that they did for me, which incidentally was about the military. They showed their helicopters coming in and rescuing people off of rooftops. And that was the drawings that they gave me. And that's my only tangible remainder of my time there. But I've never forgotten that experience. And again, just like with the Homicide, I've tried to use it in ways to make me more empathetic and better at understanding people in different shoes than my own.
So when I first reached out to you, I knew you weren't a veteran, but I knew a little bit of your backstory, and I wanted to see if there were any parallels between what you experienced, what I might call a traditional homicide, versus a military death, like a combat death or something along those lines. And I have to say, when you were just talking there, there are so many things that you mentioned that I've experienced myself, or I know other people have experienced who have been in the military. Especially that last part where you're talking about how you felt like you were almost on another planet, and you felt like these little trivial things, I should say, are just so foreign to you. Like, why would someone care so much about a hot dog, or that their Starbucks latte wasn't perfect,
or, right?
Whatever, exactly. All those little things. And I've talked to a lot of people who've had those same kind of experiences. But
go ahead.
I wanted to just kind of circle back to some of those experiences, and when you realize that you were almost like a fish out of water or on another planet, how did you deal with some of that stuff at once, when you realize that the world isn't exactly the same as it was before you had these experiences, at least not your world anyways?
No. I fell back on knowing that I tried to remind myself of the events that took place while I was there, and remind myself of some of the specifics of where I did feel useful. Like, for example, when I was in Shreveport, I found this woman that was crying, and she was sitting on a bench. She looked exhausted. And I asked her if I could help. And she said, I don't think so. She said, I need to find my brother. I want to find my brother, and I don't know where my phone is. And I said, well, you can use mine, because the Red Cross issues sat phones for us. So I loaned her my phone, and you'd think I'd given her $1 million. It was a phone call,
Right.
But that stuck with me. So I tried to remind myself of, there were some things maybe I could have done more, but I did what I could with the resources I had. And I was in it with other people who had the same focus as I did. And it's all I can ask of myself, I guess.
Right.
I had to give up on expecting other people to get it, particularly far removed from Louisiana. They saw it on the evening news, but it is not the same thing as being there. And I also took away some practical life lessons. For example, I live in an earthquake-prone area. And one of the life lessons I took away from being in Shreveport during Hurricane Katrina was you always have a bunch of cash with you in your house or in your car, because when you have extensive power outages, you have no cash machines. And if you have to buy, let's say, $20 worth of gas, and all you have is a $50 bill or $100 bill, that's what you're going to pay for $20 worth of gas, because nobody's going to give you change because they need their cash,
Right.
So it's things like that I took away. And I remember I assembled this rather large emergency evacuation kit at my house. It really made an impression on me. It's simple things like you've got to have some form of identification. You've got to, because your apartment or house could be wiped away. And that's where most of your identification is with. So how are you going to prove who you are? And if you can't prove who you are, you're not going to get it. You're not going to be entitled to any benefits that might be extended through FEMA. All you need is something like a utility bill in your name or something of that will do. So I started, gathering all this stuff, and it took me a solid 3 weeks. I'm almost full time to really prioritize and learn what I could. And my husband's looking at me, scratching his head like, is the end of the world coming here? And I said, no, it's just, I feel I can sleep better if I do this, because it puts you on edge. It's kind of like doing surveillance. I mean, you have to anticipate things because you don't know. Nobody's in control. And it's a remote possibility, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. And so I just thought, it's not hurting anybody to do this. I'm going to do it and let it go. That's all I can do, is be prepared and let it go. And then, eventually stopped talking about it with other people. But I did save my Red Cross uniform, and I've never worn it since, but it's still in there. And it reminds me of that time that I spent down there. And also one other takeaway from that was how amazing I thought the people that were the victims of Hurricane Katrina, how they organized themselves, how they concerned themselves with the welfare of other people and shared what little they had. It was a real life lesson. And I found that same to be true in some of the remote places I was in the world. So I tried to extract from those experiences life lessons that could help me and put my own situation in perspective.
Yeah. So your situation, I really do appreciate you sharing your background and your experiences, because I think, at first I wasn't sure how closely some of these things would parallel with these combat deaths or military related deaths. These things, I want to talk more about those parallels and what you see as some of the experiences that you've gone through and that you've seen through other people, and how that might be similar to what the military is experiencing.
Well, I think just the whole concept of homicide sets you apart from other people once you've experienced it. And most people have not. I mean, homicide is pretty rare, even though we're on the increase, even though we're up to about 20,000 murders a year in the United States, it's still relatively rare. So that means you're not going to be running into a lot of people who say, yeah, I had that happen to me too. And I would imagine the military is no different. Once you're out of the military, unless you live around a post or other kind of military installation, you're not going to find a lot of people that can relate to your experience. And so it has a kind of an isolating tendency to it. And I found that I don't want to open up about it. I don't want to talk about it with other people that don't understand. It's just too exhausting, for one thing, to bring it all up. And I'm not saying that about you. I'm saying about in general, I'm not going to talk to the store clerk, or my neighbor or something. Sure. In fact, most people who know me today don't have any idea that this has happened to me, because it's exhausting. And I think it opens up you for vulnerability. And I do not want to be pitied. I do not. That would infuriate me. I don't want that at all. So I don't open up about it. And it's like, why? I mean, it's not relevant to a lot of people's, what are you going to do? Talk about Christmas? Oh yeah. And by the way, I'm how do you even broach the topic? So I tend not to, only on a very selective basis, only with a real reason do what I get into it. And that's one parallel that I would think veterans and active duty would have as well. It's like, why would you go there if you don't have to? You have to have a reason to want to.
Right. And I think so. In my personal experience, my brother was killed in combat. And so when you talk about that, I understand what you're talking about, because it's because it is isolating. There's not a ton of people out there who've experienced things the way I've experienced it, or that my family has experienced it. And,
No.
it
And
is
what,
isolating.
and what
to some
other
extent.
people bring to the situation when you do open up, and I'm sure it's the same with military as it is in civilian life, they bring Hollywood with them.
Yeah.
Their knowledge of the military comes from the movies. And the knowledge of homicide and so-called homicide survivors comes from the movies. And that is so not accurate. And I don't want those stereotypes being thrust on me. I find them infuriating, in fact. So unless I'm in a position, like say giving a lecture or doing a podcast interview or something, where I'm in a position to change the minds of people and help them understand the myths, I'm not gonna do it. So I think military and civilian people are both bothered by and both affected by the misrepresentations. I mean, the stereotypes about military, they all got PTSD, and be careful because they're going to kill you if you turn your back,
Right.
And if you're a homicide survivor, you're ready for a loony bin. I'm like, no. That's not true at all. So that's another parallel. I think, however, one major difference, if I can speak to it, is that with most, and not all, but with most homicide survivors, it happens in isolation, unless they're in a mass casualty situation. So they're pretty isolated from the get-go. They don't have anybody around them, especially if the murder happened, let's say, in their own house. And they don't have anybody that can share that with them, that has been through it, that understands them. People even within their own family don't get it. It's a very lonely existence. It's better now. I mean, we have the internet and you can connect online through Facebook or other means. It's not as isolating, but I think having comrades of some kind is helpful. Even though I understand as an officer or as an enlisted, you're not openly going to talk about it either, but you probably know people that have been through it. And at least, at a distance, they know you and you know them, even if you only nod at one another. So that's a huge difference between them. I think the other is that, again, this is kind of getting back to the Hollywood movies and so on, that at least from my perspective, and I'm sure it's with the militaries, people don't die like they do in movies. In movies, they get one shot, boom, they're dead, and they just, and they're out. It's graphic. It's ugly. And when I looked at my husband, he'd been buried for 10 days and they set his head on the desk in front of me. It was ugly. It was awful. And it's so different than what they portray in movies. And you have a personal relationship with that person, although he did not look the same. I knew it was him. And those images stay with you. You don't forget them. I'm not saying that they dominate your life or you have to always have it in the forefront. But I think both soldiers and civilians who've been through this understand how really grisly it can be. It's not like the movies. And that's what upsets me about video games with, you kill people and boom, they're gone. And it just, I worry about the impact of those kinds of portrayals on people coming up, that they have no idea of how really awful it is. It's not like the movies at all.
Right. Yeah, and especially the people, you mentioned the video games, but the people who grow up playing these video games, they're in high school or whatever, they're playing Call of Duty type games where they're going and killing people, and with the expectation that that's what combat's actually like, and then they go and experience it for real in real life, and it's different. And they may think that they're prepared and they're ready for it because they've been playing these games all their lives. And I don't care how realistic the graphics are and how real things look. It's different when you're on the other end of a real gun and you're pulling a real trigger and actually seeing the other person being killed. It's not the same as what happens in a video game. And so those types of things, I agree. I think that they may be, hurting some of these people who are getting into the military or law enforcement or whatever the case may be, and where they end up in that situation and they think they're prepared for it, but they're really not. I think another topic to kind of touch on here is the topic of grief. And I know that grief is different for everyone, but is there any differences with grief from a sudden loss like a homicide or a combat death, different from something like someone who dies from an illness, more of a long-term, you know it's coming kind of thing?
Mm-hmm. I think a huge difference is that with what you're describing with somebody who has a lingering illness is that the more technical name for that is anticipatory grief, where you're anticipating the death and you can kind of get your last words in or last memories shared. And there's a preparation process and you kind of creep up on it gently and peacefully, which is very different from a situation where it's abrupt. And I think another term for what you're describing is disenfranchised grief. I think that's what a lot of soldiers must go through. Disenfranchised grief is a word that we use that means that society fails to appreciate or understand or validate the depth of the grief because it doesn't fit their model of grief. In other words, if somebody's child dies, I don't think society has any trouble understanding a lot of sorrow on the part of a parent who loses a child. But if you're a soldier, one, this is what you're trained to do. And two, you don't even know the person personally that was killed beside you. So why should it matter that much? It's not validated. That's what disenfranchised grief means. And I think that you see it in civilians too. For example, if you have a ex-spouse who dies and you're grieving, society may look at you like, well, why do you care? You divorced him or he divorced you. Why should it matter? Well, you might have a child between the two of you and you might have an amicable divorce, and it does matter. So I think that's a big difference. Also with medical, people, I think, are much, much more inclined to come up and express condolences because it's safer, it's more familiar. And I'm so sorry to hear your uncle passed, and is there anything you can do, let me know. Whereas with homicide and military deaths, I don't think people are going to approach you. I think it's more like, I don't know what to say, so I'm not going to say anything at all. And I'm going to pretend like I don't even see you. And so it isolates you even further because the lengths to which people will go either to get out of your way or to be kind of rude about it, it startles me at the insensitivity. For example, in my situation, I went to many months later, my neighbor asked me to join them for a barbecue in their backyard because I hadn't been out. I hadn't been doing anything. And they were nice neighbors. And I said, okay, I'd reluctantly agreed to it. But I kind of escaped my notice that people knew me if I didn't know them because my face had been on the news. And so this one guy, he'd had a few drinks too many, and he came up to me and, I hear you're the neighbor, right? And I said, yeah. And he goes, yeah, I heard it was a home run. And I'm like,
oh, wow.
How dare you say that? Like, what right do you have to say that to me? And I just felt like grabbing people by their lapels and just spitting on them. I was so angry. I was like, what gives you that right? And I think it's just this with homicide and with military combat. I think people don't have the same degree of comfort. And so it comes out weird. It comes out accusatory or through avoidance. And it's inappropriate a lot of the time. And people who've only experienced death from a natural death, of a loved one through illness, I don't think get those kind of responses.
Yeah, I think the responses definitely are different. I know when my brother was killed, there were varying responses. Of course, we had family and friends who reached out and they came out and supported us and everything like that, and that was great. And they were all welcome, and we're glad that they were there for us. But some of the conversations got a little awkward, especially because I was also in Afghanistan at the same time, and so some of the conversations turned to, well, have you killed anybody? It's like, well, and it's like, you know what? Why is that even relevant right now? Like we're talking about something completely different. Who cares if I killed anybody? And that's not the that's not the point of this conversation right
not
now.
At all.
And it's but just an awkward thing. And I think to your point, they didn't know what to say. It's an unexpected thing. It's not something they're familiar with. They probably never experienced anything like this before. And They just didn't
And
know
that's
how
all
to
they got to
react.
say. That's all they
Right.
got to say is, I really can't feel what it's like to be in your shoes. And I
Right.
wish I knew what to say, but my words fail me at this point. All I got to do is to tell you I'm here, but I don't get it. I wish I could help. I wish I could be of more support to you. That's all they got to say. They
Right.
don't need to
Right.
get weird and make questions like, have you ever killed somebody?
Yeah,
That is
exactly.
just so wrong.
Yeah, it is. It is. Um, and I think this kind of leads into the next thing I wanted to touch on was some of the maybe do's and don'ts of interacting with some of these people who've been homicide survivors or have survived through family or friends of someone who's died in combat or a training accident or something along those lines. What are some of the things that you do or don't do with some of these people?
I think I'll talk first about the don'ts. I think one of the things you do not do is say, I know how you feel. Unless you've been in combat, unless you've had someone die, you don't know how it feels. And so don't, because it amazes me how people will say, well, I had a dog die. I know just how you feel. And I'm like, I'm sorry, it's a little bit different. Doesn't quite match up. So don't say, I know how you feel. Another thing is to not get what I call bumper sticker remarks like, oh, I really want to express my condolences. If you need anything, let me know. I'm like, that doesn't mean anything. You hear it so many times. It's trite. It's like a parrot saying it. I think that it gets wearisome. And to say, call me if you need anything, puts the burden on the mourner to come up with, you don't know what you need. And you're certainly, even if you had a list, you're not going to probably say to them, okay, what I need right now is my oil change. Would you take care of that? You're not going to do that.
Right.
I think that's a mistake a lot of people make. A third one is, and this is more, I'm going to say this more soon after the death versus later. If it's not been very long, if the person's still in a state of shock, do not touch them. I did not want to be touched. I would go off like a rocket if somebody so much as put a finger on me. I was so on edge. I think another thing that is another do not is to try and pick their brain for details. It's like, and in my case, it was in the news a lot. And I think people who read up on it take ownership of it. It's like they're suddenly on the inner circle and they feel they're special and they can ask you detailed questions. And I'm like, you don't have the right to ask me that stuff. You're not part of my inner circle. In fact, I don't even talk about it a lot with my family, let alone somebody outside. And I would imagine if you had something in the news about a military invasion of some kind or a particular battle, that people follow it and then they think they know you and they don't. And they don't have the right to cross that barrier. I think it's also a mistake to try to get kids involved. Say your children. If you won't talk to them, come to your children. They're off limits, in my opinion. Always, whether it's a press conference or a neighbor playing with your kids, they're off limits. They don't try to get information indirectly through children. That is so wrong.
It is.
I think so far as the things that you can do, I would strongly urge people, let's say if you are a military vet and you move into an area not surrounded by other military vets, I would imagine it would mean something to have somebody come over and say, I'm welcoming you to the neighborhood. What can we do to make it more, like, for example, we always have a street party on the 4th of July and set off fireworks. Would you prefer us not to do that? Just show some kind of, I get it, to the person would be, I think, a welcoming kind of thing to do. I think that another thing is to, rather than say, what can I do? Call me if you need me. I would think it would be better to say, this is what I would like to do for you. And to come up with something specific, like, I want to cut your lawn this summer just to welcome you into the neighborhood. You don't need one more thing on your plate right now. You don't owe me a thing for it. I just want to do it. Unless you tell me otherwise, I'm going to cut your grass this summer. I had a friend whose husband, I was with her when she got the phone call that her husband committed suicide. And she was beside herself. And she was a very heavy-set woman, not in shape by any stretch of the imagination. And she, within a week, was saying, I don't know what to do about my lawn. I don't know what to do about my lawn. And it's going to look terrible. And I paid for her landscaping for that whole summer. And I know that if I had said to her, call me if you need something, she would have never said, oh, would you get my lawn cut for the summer? That would have never come up. But you would have think I'd given her $1 million. And all it was a simple landscaping thing, but it meant the world to her. And I think people need to extend themselves that way, put themselves in your shoes and say, I know this person needs X, Y, and Z. What can I do to extend that to them? Rather than just say, call me if you need something. I think another thing that's way underestimated, I can't emphasize this enough, is just the simple listening. I don't think people need advice. I don't think they need platitudes. And here I am giving advice, but I think people need silence. They need to have your listening ears there rather than what I think you should do is, or why don't you try just to listen without advice, without judgment, and not occasionally let them know you're dialed into what they're saying. But if you have that kind of a friend, you're going to get a lot further along than if you don't. I think people underestimate the importance of simple listening. There's no magic words you have to come up with, but you do have to be attentive and listen. And I think if people just have one or two people like that in their life, it can make a difference.
Yeah, for sure. And one other thing I'd like to add onto the do's list, things to do for people who have the survivors of these types of incidents. One of the things that happened when my brother was killed was everybody wanted to bring a meal over, and they
you can only have so many casseroles.
Exactly. So, which it was great, and we loved it, and the outpouring of support was great. And I'm not saying anything negative about that, but a way to maybe do that better would be to have someone organize it and say, okay, Monday, Joe is going to bring over lasagna, and Tuesday someone is going to bring over tacos, and someone, and find out, is there any dietary restrictions or things like that, so you're not bringing over a cheesecake for dessert when you got a whole family who's lactose intolerant or something.
Right.
So just having that organized, because so a few years ago, my wife, she was sick. She was in the hospital for a couple of weeks, and someone actually did that and organized a meal thing where each night there was somebody else was bringing meals to the house, and or even just a gift card for takeout from someplace. So that way we didn't have to worry about making a meal that night. And it was such a small thing for someone to do, but it was such a huge relief to us to not have to worry about getting the groceries and preparing dinner and getting everything put together and all that kind of stuff, because she was still, she wasn't 100% when she got back home, and she wasn't really up for cooking. And I had a job, and it was hard for me to juggle all of those things. And it was just a big relief. And so, stuff like that, it may seem like a small thing, but if one person could just organize that and say, okay, here's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday,
and the other thing that does is you're sparing the person from having to leave home. Yeah. I know when my husband was killed, I did not want to be out in public. I did not want to leave my house. And so anything I could do within the house, of course, this was again before the internet, which crippled the style a little bit, but anything you can do within the house that could be beneficial is appreciated. And that's why bringing food over is a great idea, especially if it's coordinated, as you said. And then if you know the person well enough, to have them sit with you if they eat. I mean, if you're by yourself, I found that I wasn't even hungry. I was down to about 100 pounds. I mean, I didn't even want to eat. I wasn't relevant to me at all. I just had sour stomach and headache, and it just went on for a long, long time. But I think that is important, and it shows that people are giving you some kind of forethought, that they're not just dropping it off and saying, well, job done, I did my little piece. And the one other thing I would strongly recommend people do is understand that when the news first breaks and the person is reeling from the deaths and going through what they're going through, that's when support swells. But 6 months, 8 months, a year later, there is nobody around, and they've all gone back to their life, and it's like it never happened. Yeah. I find, and when going through a homicide experience, what you find is you'll get a swell of support at the news break. You'll get a swell of support at the trial. You'll get a swell of support at the funeral, and it all goes away after that. And it's like it doesn't even exist. And that's about the time you're coming out of shock and you're exhausted and you look around and there's nothing. There's nobody. I remember I was trying to sell my house at that point and there was nobody. I mean, it was just me in the house, an empty house pretty much. My family had gone back to Arizona because they couldn't stay any longer than they did. And of course, my husband was gone because he was the one that was killed. I had no children. So, and it was winter on top of it. So it was a time where it would be sure nice if somebody had just called and said, I haven't forgotten. I remember what it was like in July for you. And here it is, January. And how you doing? But nobody called. Nobody did. Right. I think we tend to forget that. And so the way to do that is just put a reminder in your smartphone. Call George in July or something. Let him know you're still thinking about him and you haven't forgotten. I have a friend whose son was killed at the Pulse nightclub. And every June, I contact him on the date of that death. And I haven't forgotten your son, haven't forgotten your son. And he said, I'm the only person that does it. And it's such a little thing, but it lets you know that the world hasn't forgotten.
Right. And that's a big thing that people haven't forgotten. And I get that too. Every year, there's a handful of people who reach out on the anniversary or, around that time frame, maybe not on the exact day, but give or take a few days. They reach out and just say, hey, just thinking about you, your family, and, hope you guys
wonderful.
Are doing okay and all that kind of stuff. And you're right. The support does fade over time. I mean, it was almost overwhelming, the amount of support we had in the beginning.
And you're not in a position to make use of it. You're in shock.
Right, exactly. But then it does fade over time. And not to say that we don't appreciate the support, because we always appreciate, anybody who comes out and showed their support. But it was overwhelming at first. And then a year later, it was trickled down to nothing, and then picked up around the anniversary. You got some support then, and then faded away real quickly after that. And then the next year's anniversary was a little
less so, yeah,
and then a little less, and then a little less, and and I'm very grateful. This is now over 11 years now since he's been gone, and I still do have people who reach out, and it's it is a nice thing that they still do. But you're right. It's one of those things where it ebbs and flows. It's you get it's almost like drinking from a fire hose in the beginning, where you're getting way too much.
Exactly.
You don't know what to do with it all, and it's too much. And then you're just getting little trickles down the road here and there, if anything at all.
Right. Right.
So.
I had a story of a woman I had on my podcast that I thought would be relevant to you, and I wanted to briefly describe what happened. Sure. I touch upon many different kinds of homicide on my podcast. This one is on familicide, which is a form of homicide in which somebody within the family kills a family member. She was 4. Her mother told her to go upstairs and wake her brother up. And she was excited because it was time to play Super Mario. And so she went upstairs to waken her little, slightly older brother up, took the pillow off his head, and his throat had been slit by her mother. So her mother sent her up there knowing that's what she was going to see. And he'd been dead several hours. Anyway, of course, her mom was arrested. She had no father. So she was an orphan, basically, and bounced around from foster home to group home. And she was a mess, as you can imagine. Not enough intervention psychologically. She had some, but it wasn't enough. Anyway, as she neared adolescence, she decided, I got to do something to get out of this state of mind I'm in, because she was very reactive and angry and lost. And she said, I need weapons. I need how to learn to use weapons, and I need camaraderie, and I need to be in physical shape. And then it hit her, I'm going to join the military. So she did. And she went to Afghanistan. She got honors for her service, and she came out of it. And now she's written a chapter in a book that's coming out soon. And, my hat's off to her. She found her niche. And I raised that story only to drive home the point that PTSD is not a life sentence. It doesn't mean you can't use it and direct it and get over it in some way. There are various ways to do it. It sometimes happens before you even get in the military, as is her case. But for her, the military was a godsend. I don't know how she would have fared better than she did, really. And she was surrounded by people who she said were extremely supportive. So,
I mean, that's great to hear too, that the military could be that support for someone who clearly that person lost everything. They lost their sibling, they lost their mother in that case as well, because and then just bouncing around and feeling kind of lost, and the military is really great at that, at getting that camaraderie. And
she had a sense of belonging.
Exactly. Yeah. And you touched on another interesting point too, is the PTSD from someone who witnesses some of these traumatic events, whether it's a combat death or in this person's case, seeing their brother laying there in bed and everything. There's certainly a traumatic aspect to all of this. So what is it, if someone has witnessed something like this, what are some of the signs to look out for in those people? So maybe for a loved one's perspective, looking out for them and making sure that the PTSD isn't overwhelming on them, and that they can get the help if it's needed.
I think one of the first things that comes to mind is to get to know them and their symptoms well enough to know what their triggers are. They're all unique. They needn't be obvious. In my situation, it's baseball bats. I want nothing, still to this day, and I'm talking almost 40 years later, if I walk into a restaurant in summer where they'll have the baseball game on the TVs in a restaurant, I'll try to sit as far away from it as I can. I don't want to hear it, because inevitably you're going to hear a back crack, or you're going to hear a comment like crack of the bat, or that was a home run. And that just chills me. Have to go back and think about that. It pulls me right back. And I used to love baseball before all that happened. I used to play baseball. So I think knowing their triggers and helping them know what to do. You can't always avoid the triggers, like my restaurant situation or fireworks or whatever it might be, but have them prepare ahead of time for what is your emergency toolkit going to be? How are you going to handle it? Well, a real simple one is deep breathing. Believe it or not, it's very helpful. It resets your blood pressure and so on, and teaching them and helping them go along with some emergency kind of first aid would be helpful, and help them with it. Help them avoid the trigger in the first place, if you possibly can, would be a huge one. And then secondly, if it can't be avoided and it happens in some way, can you get them away from it and just, again, sit with them? You don't have to talk. You don't have to say anything, but just get them out of the situation and let them regroup. And chances are they'll do okay. I think, it's a fine line. You don't want to treat them like they're a casualty, but on the other hand, you don't want to be a hardened about it either. And so you have to strike this balance and knowing what their triggers are. They may not even know what they are until they sit and actually give it some thought, because when you're reacting, you're not thinking, you're just reacting. It's physiological. I think that would be a huge thing. Another thing would be to discourage certain things that are not helpful, like substance abuse, and encourage them, if they need to get professional care. Or this other thing that I've come across not too long ago, maybe you've heard of it. It's Canines for Warriors. Have you heard of them?
I've heard of them. Yeah.
Yeah. They're free. I mean, what a great idea. And these dogs have come from kill shelters or surrendered by their owners. And so it's a win-win for them too, to go through this training. And, I don't know, but I'm a little bit biased. I love dogs. So maybe that's my bias here coming through. But I think something like that is face saving, because it's not, quote, psychotherapy. It's not a medication. For all the world knows, you're just out there walking your dog. I mean, maybe it says service dog, but there's a lot of reasons people have service dogs. They can have them for epilepsy, for example.
Yep.
So people don't jump to the conclusion, oh, you got that because you have PTSD. No, although they are finding that it helps with not just PTSD, but these dogs are also helping with suicidology, with suicidal thinking, and depression, which I can totally get, when I'm around my dogs. I mean, they make me happy. And they're very, very, if I don't feel well, they're so attentive. I have St. Bernards, and so they're pretty big, and they'll put their heads on my bed and just stare at me if I don't feel well and stay there and glare at me like, are you going to get out of bed yet? Are you going to get out of bed yet? But they don't move. They don't do nothing. I didn't train them. That's just how they are,
Right.
I just feel happy when I'm around them. So that's that. I think another thing is when the mind is freaking out, when you're going to have flashbacks or be upset. I think a basic rule of thumb is if your mind is upset, you exercise your body, you do something physical. So go running or take a walk with your dog, or if all you can manage is dancing in your room, do that. But do something physical, something that moves large muscles, I think is a great way to drain off that tension, and vice versa. If you're exhausted physically, use your head. I mean, read, watch a good video, and get that balance. I think sometimes people are too much in their head if they have PTSD, and they ruminate about it and they try to analyze it and they what if and blah, blah, blah. And sometimes you just got to get out of your head and go switch gears and do something physical. And the last thing I think it's kind of a bigger project, or which is kind of like what you and I are doing, is you find some way to make something good come out of it, whether it's a podcast or whether it's a painting or whether it's a book, volunteer work, make a law. Is there a way you can change a law that's not right in your community or state? I think there's nothing like advocacy. It's not something you can do in the beginning, but I'm talking more long-term. That helps you become accountable to yourself and to your quote mission, and you're helping other people in the interim. So you're, in my mind, it's like, because I have a book coming out and I have this podcast that I have, it makes me feel like it's not for nothing. It's not wasted. It's at least making some good come out of it. And that gives me peace of mind, because if nothing good came out of it, then why did I get put through this? That's pretty bleak, but I want to make use of it for other people. And then it's at least something salvageable from it.
Yeah, for sure. And I've had that same experience where I've written a book and
I did not know that.
Yeah. So, and the book has to do with the experience of losing my brother and all that stuff. And it's, it feels good knowing that not only is the book out there to help other people who have gone through some other kind of trauma or grief or things like that, but it also serves to continue telling his story. He's no longer around to tell his side of the story, and
it's there forever. It's
there forever. It's going to outlive me. It's going to outlive my kids and everyone else that I'm capable of telling the story to. It'll outlive all of us, and it'll just continue on. And I think that's a great thing to do. I want to go back to something that you mentioned about the dogs and not necessarily service dogs, but just dogs in general, or pets maybe in general. Maybe that's a better way to look at it, because not everyone's a dog person. I am, but but we can't all be perfect, I guess, right? But I heard a story once of a guy who he had firearms in his home, and he was struggling with depression, and he was starting to feel suicidal. And first off, if there's a way to remove those from the home and get them out of there, that's one step, because that's certainly not something you want to have around for just a moment where you just can't handle it anymore and things like that. But in this guy's case, he had no place to move them to or anything like that. He didn't have any people nearby that he could hand them off to or anything. So what he did was he took the key to his gun safe and he put it around his dog's collar. And he said the only way that he was able to get access to his guns was he had to go through his dog first. And he said he just loved that dog so damn much that there was no way he would be able to do anything to hurt himself after going through his dog. And
wow.
Maybe not the most ideal circumstance and situation.
Hey, it worked.
But you know what? If it works, it works.
That's right.
It's what's the saying? If it's dumb but it works, it ain't dumb.
That's right.
So I think pets can definitely have a tremendous impact on us. And they, like you were saying, when you're sitting in bed and your dogs come up to you and they're like, are you getting up? Or they do tend to sense things. My wife, when she was in the hospital, I mentioned that earlier, she had epilepsy. She had never had it before ever in her life. And our dog at the time, she started to notice when my wife was having epilepsy, and she would come up and start to nudge her when a seizure was about to start. It was before my wife even realized that there was going to be a seizure, but the dog would come up and start to nudge her, and she wasn't trained for it or anything like that. It's just, she had been around us all of our lives. And so she noticed these differences in the body chemistry, or I don't know really what it was that she was noticing.
Yes.
And she noticed it coming. And so she went and nudged her. And we started to realize that's what she was doing. And every single time that my wife had a seizure, the dog was there and was giving her a little nudge. Exactly.
So, I think they know a lot more than we give them credit for.
They do. They may look dumb on the outside, but they're pretty smart. So
yeah, mine look like drooling beasts, but they're really not that stupid, really, when you get down to it.
Right. Was there anything else that you wanted to add today about whether it's homicide or grief or PTSD or anything else that might be relevant to the conversation?
There's 2 points I wanted to raise, and one is, and I'm not trying to find excuses for anybody to say I can't get better. That's not my intention here, but I do want to mention that with military training, sometimes the very training that you go through tends to strengthen the PTSD response, such as, for example, if you're in training for combat, you're supposed to be you're supposed to be a light sleeper, sleep with one eye open, stay alert, stay alive. And that's what PTSD is like, is you cannot sleep. You are very you have a lot of insomnia going on, and you are always on edge. I think another similarity is that if you're trained for combat, they're not trying to train you to think empathetically about the enemy. You don't want to think, does that person over there have a mother, a sister, a child? They're the enemy and I'm going to take them out. And so it is with PTSD. It's like you're not thinking about the impact of your behavior on other people because it's been so ingrained in you to suck it up and be strong. A third similarity is that in military training, you're taught to be mission focused, get on with it. Your own personal ailments and needs aren't as important as the big picture. And so if you have a headache, so what? If you got a stomach ache, big deal. And I think when you have PTSD, you're so driven to I've got to get this thing done. The heck with my symptoms. I can't succumb to that. I've got to get this thing done. And you tend to neglect yourself because of it. So my point being that, you can't take the soldier out of the soldier once they're discharged. It doesn't mean they're not a soldier anymore. And that training is still inherent in them. And that, I believe, makes it more difficult, more challenging. I'm not saying it's hopeless, but I do think it's a reason why PTSD is extra challenging if you've experienced it as a soldier, and why the treatment has to take those factors into account. You can't treat it the same as you would PTSD from a civilian rape, for example. It's not, because you don't go through training to be a rape victim. You don't. It just happens to you. So they're not identical. I think that's often overlooked. The other thing I wanted to say is I had a couple of quotes, if you'll indulge me, that I wanted to read to you about PTSD. Yeah, one comes from Brigadier General Gary S. Patton. He said, one of our soldiers, Specialist Robert Unruh, took a gunshot wound to the torso. I was involved in medevacing him off the battlefield, and in a short period of time, he died before my eyes. That's a memory that will stay with me the rest of my life. He was only 25. The stress hits hardest in the middle of the night. I've lost 69 men over a year-long duty. That wakes me up. I've had sleep interruptions from loud noises. Of course, there's no IEDs or rockets going off in my bedroom, but the brain has a funny way of remembering those things, not only recreating the exact sound, but also the smell of the battlefield and the metallic taste you get in your mouth when you have that same incident on the battlefield. We need all our soldiers and leaders. That's a key, I think. We need all our soldiers and leaders to approach mental health like we do physical health. No one would ever question or hesitate to see a physician to take care of a broken limb or a gunshot wound or shrapnel. We need to take that same approach towards mental health. I sought help for my depression, my anger, and grief, and I think I'm a better general for it. Second quote, General Carter Ham. He's a 4-star general, commanded the 1st Infantry Division, called the legendary Big Red One, before assuming duties as director for global operations at Joint Staff at the Pentagon. He said, we were in Mosul when a suicide bomber blew up a mess tent. 22 soldiers died that day. It was the 21st of December, 2004, the worst day of my life ever. I cannot imagine how a day could be worse than that. To this day, I still ask myself, what could I have done differently? What could I have done as a commander responsible that would have perhaps saved the lives of those soldiers and civilians? After I felt what I was doing was no longer important because I had soldiers who were killed in a mission that had not been accomplished. It took an amazing supportive wife, and in my case, a great chaplain, to help me work my way through it. Ham and his wife drove from Washington State to the District of Columbia right after he returned from combat. And he went on to say, I probably said 3 words to her the whole way across the country. And it was, do you want to stop to get something to eat? I mean, no discussion, no sharing of what happened, where my head was at. If you ask for help, others think of you as weak. That's so wrong. Intellectually, we all know it's wrong, but it's still there. I've learned to cope with the memories. It was a tough road. I was withdrawn. I wanted to still be back there. And what I was doing, I felt here was not important. I think, frankly, I'm a better general because I got some help. So my point being, if generals can do it, everybody can do it. I mean, I wish that the culture would change and make it so you're not penalized for getting help. But I want to dispel the myth that no one in senior positions takes a blind eye to this. That's not true. There are people that have been through it and get it. That there are people that have been through it and willing to get help.
And I think that makes some of the best leaders are the ones who lead by example and do the things that maybe are not popular, not the type of thing that you want to do, but
because if you don't, you're leaving is it a better option to have people raw with PTSD walking around with guns?
Right, exactly.
Or do you want people that are treated and are getting a grip on it walking around, And it's the same kind of culture, by the way, in the medical community. If you have surgeons and so on that have PTSD or depression, you're not supposed to go for treatment. And you can have some comeuppance if it's got out that you went for treatment for those things. Because who wants who wants a scalpel in a surgeon's hand knowing they have PTSD? Well, we don't want you on our hospital staff. And I'm like, that's so ass backwards. They ought to be congratulated for getting help and getting on top of it.
Right, exactly. Because you become a better version of yourself by being able to grow from the experiences. Right. And sometimes you need help doing that. And it's the same thing with just about any other thing. If that same surgeon broke their arm riding a bicycle and they went to go see another doctor to get their arm fixed and put it in a cast, no one's going to think twice about that and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe you would do that. Here's
the sad thing about PTSD is so much of it is looked at as a psychological problem when in fact, so much of it is neurological and biochemical and neurohormonal. If you really look at it in detail, which I'm not going to get into it, that bores everybody, I know, but it is. You get into things about the amygdala and cortisol and, kind of boring things like that, but it is not weak-willed or poor personality. It's physical. It's not a whole lot different from diabetes when you get down to it. Many medical conditions affect behavior, and this is no different, but we don't look at it that way, which is so sad because help is available.
There's lots of help available. And for the people who would like to seek help, there are great people over at the VA, but if you don't want to or can't go to the VA for whatever reason, there's people all over the place who are offering the type of treatment and therapies and counseling and everything else that you could possibly need to overcome some of these things. And it would be silly not to try some of them.
Right.
And if one thing doesn't work, guess what? There's probably something else.
That's right.
Just keep trying and keep trying and trying.
Because what doesn't work, and that's what you're already doing. So what have you got to lose?
Right. Exactly. Right. If what you're doing right now is obviously putting you in a bad situation, what does it hurt to try something else? The best case scenario is you walk out with something that works. Worst case scenario, you're still in the same position that you're in now, and you're better off because you know that thing didn't work. So now you can scratch that one off the list and go try something else.
That's right. Yeah, and that's another parallel with physical health, is that if you go to see a doctor that you don't particularly like and you don't feel they've benefited you from your diabetes or your high blood pressure, whatever the reason is you went, you don't just say, well, I tried physical help and that I've given up on doctors altogether because I had this one that wasn't any good. You're more likely to say, well, I'm going to get another doctor.
Yeah,
I'm going to try something different. And that's the same with the psychological. You don't give up on the whole thing. Just maybe you got a bad apple. It's possible. They're out there.
Right. Exactly.
I know psychologists I wouldn't send my dog to. But no names.
No, definitely no names. No names. But there's definitely those situations where you just get the wrong person.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that
not there.
The treatment's not going to work for you. It just means that person, maybe they're inexperienced in that particular form of therapy, or they don't understand the combat related issues that maybe that you're going through. Or
I think if they get a trauma informed therapist who's familiar with combat related PTSD, who's experienced, who's formally trained, they have a much better chance of finding somebody who's going to be able to meet their needs.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today and going through all of this. I'd love to give you the opportunity to let people know where they can go to get in touch with you and find out more about what you do and everything like that.
I've kept it real simple. I just have one thing. I don't do all the little Twitters and all that. I don't have time. So I keep it real simple. It's just my website. So I know that's kind of old school, but if they just go to www.jancanty.com, everything is there. They're going to find material on the podcast and so forth. If I can say one thing, it's the book that I have hopefully coming out in spring. It's not 100% done, but it's getting darn close. It's called Coping with the Violent Death of Your Loved One. And it's going to be not just about homicide, but suicide. It's going to be directed at the survivors. It takes you through the death notification, the funeral planning, the investigation, on down through trial, probation, and parole hearings and all that. So I've written the book in conjunction with about 12 other experts. I've called upon them, networking wise, to contribute their benefit to it. And hopefully it'll make some people, give them a roadmap as to what they can do in those situations.
That's a great resource to have, and I'll definitely add that to the show notes for this episode when the book comes out. So, so be sure to keep me updated on that and let me know when that comes out, and I'll update the show notes. But for everyone else, the website that she mentioned earlier will be also in the show notes, so you can check that out there, and that way you can find out more about Jan and what she does, and probably find out about the book when it comes out as well. If you post that on your website as well, I'm sure that people will be able to find it all there. So again, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate your time and for coming on and sharing your story.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your service.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Drive On Podcast. If you want to check out more episodes or learn more about the show, you can visit our website, driveonpodcast.com. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Drive On Podcast.